Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In this lecture, we will look at two interlinked aspects. One is the political process model and resource mobilization theory, which have been used over the past 30 to 40 years by research scholars, by media person also, in order to understand social movements. Now, the reason these two models, the political process model or PPM and resource mobilization theory are empty, they are key is that they have been used to understand collective action. Now, when you speak about collective action, this is not just about any movement, rather how people form a collective, and once they form a collective or once they create a collective, how do they come together for a particular and specific goal, and it is always action oriented. So that is the reason why this kind of social movements are organized around inequality and power, and they are also responses to inequality and power. The other aspect of collective action and its theorizing is that collective action is not just about protest. So there could be protests in our day-to-day lives, but when it is about a collective action, that means there has to be certain models through which the sum total of all the individuals who are participating in a protest is bigger than the individual interests. In other words, there has to be a condition, there has to be circumstances in which each individual who is participant to a movement feels that they are an inseparable part of that collective. It could be understood as a mass psychology, it could be understood as a mass consciousness, but here we are looking at it in terms of collective action as part of social movement. So both political process theory as well as resource mobilization theory, they look at questions of, particularly in the Indian case, they look at questions of caste, they look at questions of gender, they look at questions of poverty, they look at questions of environmental distress, as well as they look at questions of how there are intersectionalities between caste, gender, poverty and environment. So let us explore further on this. The first is that we're going to discuss today is political process model or PPM. It was developed by McAdam way back in the 1960s and 70s, but it was popularized by Tarot in his 1998 book, in which he looks at three the key aspects. One is politics, second is structure, and third is framing. And within these three, Tarot argues that politics needs to be understood as political opportunities. Structure needs to be understood in terms of mobilizing structures, and framing needs to be understood as framing processes. In other words, when you talk about political opportunities, it is about what kind of policy shifts are there, who is making these policies, whether the people in power, there is a split in the way they are governing, or there is a crisis there, and can this crisis be utilized by certain groups in order to create a circumstance where these circumstances can be looked at in terms of opportunities. So in the year 2008 as well as 2009, a few cases emerged in the Indian context. The UPA government that had come back to power with a thumping majority, and nobody was there to stop the moment or stop the movement of centralization of a particular kind of polity. Dr. Manmohan Singh was very popular at that time, but what the Supreme Court of India did was it made certain assumptions with the Comptroller and Auditor General of India regarding the so-called 2G scam, regarding the coal block scam, and highly intelligible as well as highly figurative numbers were spread in order to create a crisis of governance. Later on, it was found out that all these figures were merely notional. There was no ground on which these notional figures were created. But what the opposition did was it got a moment that there is a split in polity regarding corruption, and with the help of mass media, with the help of different kind of media and also the corporate houses, a mass movement of India against corruption was created, which made the UPA government in power deeply unpopular and gave rise to the BJP that we witness today. So the political opportunities, many a times they arise, many a times they are constructed, and because we are in a course of political sociology, so we need to understand that many a times these political opportunities are socially constructed and politically constructed. There may be an actual crisis, there may be no actual crisis, but crises are manufactured. Sometimes these crises are managed. So how the opportunities arise and how the opportunities are managed is part of what Taro would argue about political opportunities in terms of one of the three pillars of a political process model. The second is that of mobilizing structures, in which you have networks, community organizations and informal groups. So the example that I just gave about India against corruption brought under its umbrella different kind of organizations, from the political left to the political right, to the extreme political left to the extreme political right, as well as many of the corporate houses. So there are a lot of scholarly literature available now as to what extent the coming together of these networks helped India against corruption, but also what is noteworthy to note here is how these networks were constructed to make them look organic, to make them look that they are actually speaking for the people of this country, that corruption is the biggest cause of India's backwardness, and once this corruption is over, then things will be good, things will be normal, and we will become a developed country. So these networks were not just political networks, but most often than not these were informal groups. So informal groups could be part of community organizations, or they could be independent of community organizations but resemble that of community organizations. Informal groups could be closed WhatsApp groups or closed Facebook groups, in which people are sharing their thoughts and certain narrative is being constructed, and this leads us to what Taro would call framing, in which you have creation of shared meanings to inspire action. Corruption is the most important problem in Indian society. Now that is part of a shared meaning. Why? Because if you say that the so-called 2G scam created a notional loss of 2 lakh crore rupees, or why 2 lakh, say 200 lakh crore rupees, it's just a notional number. Nobody needs to justify that number as to from where that number came, but When you have a mobilizing structure and you are creating political opportunities and creating different kind of formal and informal groups and networks, then those shared meanings get transcribed to the lowest minimum possible degree. What does this mean? It means that each one of us who is a citizen of this country or who is not even a citizen of this country faces one or other aspect of corruption, whether in the hands of local government officials or panchayat officials or anybody for that matter. So corruption is part and parcel of our life and our lives. So when somebody says that because of this government and as it was trying to favor a certain corporate houses, 20 lakh crore rupees got lost. Nobody knows what is the actual figure of 20 lakh rupees, how many zeros are there in 20 lakh crore, but people do understand that if this 20 lakh crore would not have been lost, then it could have been part of our lives. Maybe government would have done something extra. Then it got attached to something even more interesting, which was the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And that MGNREGS, there was a lot of corruption that was going on, and many people in rural areas, particularly the marginalized sections, that was their everyday life. So the transcription of certain language, the transcription of certain meanings were part and parcel of a process that is political, and this politics is linked to the social aspects. So India against corruption became a dynamic movement, and this dynamic movement had the right political timing, the way it was framed by organizations who stayed behind the curtain and push forward people like Arvind Kejriwal, that they are the ones who are going to fight against corruption and make this country corruption free. And they had their own political opportunities after that. So this is how the Taro and others have tried to understand political processes through these three significant pillars. Next is the resource mobilization theory that we had discussed in the previous lecture also, which developed in the 1970s by McCarthy and Salt, in which their focus was about rational strategic organizations and how material and non-material, the access to material and non-material resources are crucial. Material in terms of funds and logistics, and non-material in terms of leadership and solidarity. So as I discussed in the previous example, funds and logistics were significant. That is the reason why India Against Corruption became an umbrella organization, so that funds could be collected from different resources or different sources, and logistics could be arranged so that a very long kind of movement can be organized in the heart of Delhi. At the same time, if you look at year 2020-21, the farmers movement also did the same thing. They had both funds as well as logistics to stay put on the borders of Delhi for almost a year, and the movement gained ground to an extent that it was not only discussed inside the country but also outside of it. People wrote about them in newspapers, they spoke about it, discussed about it in news media, in the social media, as well as research articles and books. So resource mobilization becomes a significant source of how things are done. There is a very interesting anecdote that I would like to share with you about Iraq. So when the United States invaded Iraq and then they toppled the Saddam Hussein, a lot of movements were happening, and they call these movements with very colorful names. Somewhere it was about pink revolution, somewhere it was about orange revolution, or in the case of Egypt, they called it the Arab Spring. Now, in the case of Arab Spring, they identified one place called the Tahrir Square. And one interesting fact that happened, and this is a part of legend now, we don't know to what extent this is true or to what extent it is false, or there is partial truth and partial falsehood, but this is how it is narrated. So there was there was an American general. He would say that every day in the evening, people would gather at a particular place in many locations in the Arab world, and then they would start protesting, and the protests would go on for hours on end. So he identified that every day before the protests start, there would be people who would organize for food, the stalls and others in those areas. So because of those food stalls, at the end of the day, people would come, have snacks and protest. And in between, if they are getting a little tired, they'll do the same thing, have some snacks, drink something, and then continue the protest. So what this general did was that he disallowed the installment of the snack spaces, and then they realized that over a period of 1 week, the entire crowd has died out. No more protests are happening, and even if there are certain protests, they don't last that long. So this way, leadership solidarity within the resource mobilization theory, part of the material and non-material resources. When you bring people together, that means there is solidarity. That means and leadership can also emerge from there. If no, then this entire mobilization will remain ineffective. The other side of the story is that anytime there is the leadership emerging, youth jail them or put them behind bars. Or if you identify that there are certain allies to them, for example, external allies in the form of NGOs, donors and political parties, make sure that these NGOs do not get any funding. Close down their FCRA clearances, or these donors, they don't get enough funding, or then seize their bank accounts. That way they can never succeed in providing both the material as well as non-material resources. So your grievances, in other words, also require resources. Without resources or with insufficient resources, your grievances will just remain grievances, they cannot be articulated further. So you have social movement organizations who are particularly linked to NGOs and donor agencies and political parties. As we had discussed previously, the left parties are very good at organizing protests, like the farmers march, tribals and farmers march that had happened a few years back from different parts of Maharashtra to Mumbai, and in which the left political parties had organized them and extended their support. So you would see the red flags flying everywhere when they were marching, and social media amplified it. The people of Mumbai would greet these people, the farmers and tribals who had been marching, many of them barefoot, and their barefoot and or their broken slippers would be posted on Facebook, on many other social media, so that it can be amplified. So these are all part of material and non-material kind of resources that the social mobilization theory speaks about. Now, social mobilization theory is corresponding to resource mobilization theory because resources are mobilized through social action and through the social networks. But as we had discussed previously, one of the key critiques of this kind of a theory is that it overemphasizes structure and neglects ideology and identity, which we will discuss in a little while. So, in the Indian state, how do we understand these two theories, particularly in terms of resource mobilization and political processes. What are the opportunities and constraints that the Indian state provides? So, the Indian state is both an enabler and repressor of collective actions. So, in terms of access points, because we are a democracy, so we have periodic elections, courts and commissions. Because we also have a constitution which provides us guarantees regarding equality, reservation and rights based provisions. But at the same time, we also have patronage networks and caste hierarchies that mediate access to opportunities. Now, this is where political sociology plays a key role. You can have constitutional guarantees, you can have democratic structures which offer access points of elections, courts and commissions, but unless and until you are part of particular patronage networks, your caste hierarchies mediate what kind of opportunities are available to you and what kind of opportunities are not available to you. You can speak of equality, you can speak of egalitarianism as an idea, as an ideology, but if you are not linked to specific caste hierarchies and patronage networks across border. So, I am not speaking about political patronage or some other kind of patronage across border, across the aisle also. We cannot have opportunities gaining access to different strata of population. Now, the second or the other side of the Indian state is its repressive state apparatuses that we had discussed previously, like police violence, surveillance or co-optation. Now, co-optation is very interesting here, primarily because what we see, as we will discuss in a little moment, co-optation is about taking the best minds or most resourceful person available to the opposition group, induce them or lure them with financial or non-financial kind of perks, so that they can leave the other side and become part of your side. If not, then police violence is always there. So, before police violence, for co-optation to happen, surveillance of particular individuals or particular groups are important. That is the reason why a democratic Indian state is both powerful in terms of providing the patronage as well as to repress the people and its citizens. Now, the first today we will discuss two case studies while using the two theories that we had started off with. The first is the Dalit movement and political process. So, when you are talking about Dalit movement, as we have been discussing throughout this course, it did not start with independence itself, or does not end with reservation. Rather, it started maybe during the colonial period in the 19th century, but it got a lot of emphasis because of Dr. Ambedkar's strategy as well as his endeavor, particularly for having separate electorates. Separate electorate means that there would be specific reserved constituencies or specific reserved seats in the parliament, in the assembly as well as other kind of democratic forums, where individuals or adults of a particular sect, adults of a particular community would be able to vote. That means if you have one constituency where you have a candidate and this candidate is SC. So, this SC candidate can be voted by other SC groups who are part of that constituency. So, the idea of this separate electorates is that it would not dilute the political activism of the leaders who are emerging from SCs, STs, other minority communities. So another argument that is presented here is that through Pune Pact between Gandhi and Ambedkar, this idea was completely eradicated and killed. I think killed is a better word than eradicated. Why? The argument that Dalit scholars as well as Dalit activists have made is that with the reservation system, although we have specific representatives in terms of SCs and STs in Parliament of India as well as assembly houses, still they are co-opted because they now require the support of dominant political parties who are run primarily by the upper caste to get elected, first to get the seat and then get elected to the parliament. And most interestingly, even if you see all the numbers that are available with us, if there is a constituency which is not reserved for SC or ST, no SC or ST gets elected or even gets to fight or contest in that constituency. So that's a tragedy of the matter, and that's the tragedy of electoral politics that is practiced here with the disintegration of separate electorates. So while the rise of BSP as a political vehicle is significant in a particular manner because it gave voice and gave India its first Dalit woman chief minister who happened to be a Dalit, but all across the country we do not see a replication of that. We do not see that the majority of the people or the Bahujans getting elected and forming government throughout the country. Even if somebody is there, they happen to be co-opted. The Mandal era shift created new alliances, yes, but these new alliances need to be looked at to what extent they have been emancipatory for the minority groups. And when I speak about minority groups, it includes SCs, STs and other religious minorities. It is not just about the religious minorities alone. So Dalit movement created these organizational structures in the form of Republican Party, BSP, Satyasodhak Samaj, so on and so forth, and took into consideration Ambedkarite ideology, the blue flag, the literature, art and commemoration. But these are the resources that require continuous external support in the form of NGOs, in the form of electoral alliances. Without that, while literature, art and commemoration have survived, but the other kind of political organizations are not able to build that momentum. So with a lack of momentum or with the receding of momentum, we don't know what is going to happen to literature, art and commemoration. Even if literature and art survive, we don't know whether we'll have more commemorative kind of institutions or buildings or the other kind of spaces emerging. Another is that of Dalit feminism, in which the opportunity and resources that are constructed here, particularly to look at the standpoint of Dalit women, is crucial. Why? Because Dalit women are excluded both from mainstream Dalit as well as women's movements. In other words, while Dalit movement spoke about the experiences of Dalits, it excluded the experiences of Dalit women. While women's movement in India spoke about the experiences of women, it excluded the experiences of Dalit women. That is the reason why when Sharmila Rege speaks about Dalit women speak differently, that means that it is high time that we consider Dalit women as a specific and special category of subalterns whose voices and narratives are usually suppressed, and how this suppression can be countered through an intersectionality of caste, class and gender specificities. The second case study, which is related to the first case study, is that of women's movement and the state. Now 1970s and 80s witnessed autonomous women's groups like the Forum Against Oppression, All India Democratic Women's Association, so on and so forth. And the 1992 the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments created and gave spaces to the women in the legislative bodies, particularly in the panchayat structure and as well as urban panchayat structure. But what we look here is that the empowerment rhetoric also led to de-radicalization, which means that the 1990s also witnessed a lot of NGOization of some of these movements, and this NGOization was donor funded professional activists. So the moment, as I said, the moment this donor funding was stopped or restricted, the professional activists, they receded to the ground because they were not getting their salaries. So if they are not getting their salaries and the projects are no longer there, then how would they work on women's issues? And why would they go to a Dalit household, an Adivasi household or a backward class household and speak to those women and bring out their ideas and bring out their voices to the public? But what this overt kind of resource mobilization lacked, it got underground in the form of ideological struggles on digital media, because digital media does not require as much resources as to organize physical movements. So the two aspects of it, the physical movement and digital movement, when they come together, then we can witness a mass uprising in the form of social movements. But in the traditional sense, to understand the digital activism, it will be like it's useless. It is not, as we have witnessed in different examples, but the network's ideology and voluntary labor as part of resource mobilization theory needs to be relooked at, and how sometimes it is also significant to understand how digital activism can actually work in support of women's movement and bridge the gap between movement and the state. New social movements, as a matter of fact, have tried to bridge these two theories, because what they are doing is that they are looking at the legal openings, elite alliances, global solidarity, and at the same time how media can be used, how transnational networks can be used, not just to mobilize resources but also to make a common cause with people and groups throughout global south, and many a times to bridge the global north and the global south. When both of them come together, then you are able to make a lot of noise and make a lot of impact on the ground, both at a global level as well as a local level. And the best example for this is the climate change narratives. So people understand climate change and environmental changes differently according to the specific contexts. But the idea of an age of Anthropocene and climate crisis brings to forefront what is happening at a global level. It's not just what you and me we are doing, rather what is happening across the globe and how it is going to impact us. The same thing about the inequalities, how inequalities are getting constructed and reinforced because of globalization, liberalization and privatization. So these are not non-structural issues, they are structural issues that are being replicated and reproduced over time. And new social movements, by bridging the gap between the class issues and identity issues and cultural issues, are trying to make visible very finite as well as infinite problems that are occurring throughout the globe. So in the Indian case, as we discussed, Dalit and feminist movements show a need for intersectional adaptation, and intersectionality would give rise to hybrid kind of struggles where we are looking at both redistribution and recognition, the old social movements and the new social movements. The hybridization of movements in India, about politics and resource mobilization, is what creates the conditions. So there's a few questions for discussion. At the end of this week, we can look at some of these issues, or once we have our live session, we can also discuss these issues. So some of the works that we discussed in today's lecture are cited here. There are certain works which are for further readings. Thank you.